Thanks for joining us this week on the show. I had such a rich conversation with Liz Onyeabor. She has been a coach and worked with corporate, executive, and private clients for quite a while. She's authored several books, and right now, her passion is helping perfectionists break free and break through the limits that they struggle with in creating business and in living a happier and more fulfilled life. If you can relate to perfectionism on any level, and as you'll discover inside, there are several, this is going to be a great conversation for you. Thanks for joining us this week. Living in a stressful world doesn't mean you have to give up on happiness. Instead, you can shift your perspective of stress and discover how to live your life in flow. Welcome to Happified. I'm your host, Susie Vine. Join me for inspiration and interviews with folks who are shining their light in the world in the areas of positive mindset, health, and wellness. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome back. I'm so happy to have you with me this week for this episode of Happified featuring my guest, Elizabeth Onyeabor. Elizabeth is a leading international expert on perfectionist leaders and high achievers. As the founder of Innergenuity, she coaches leaders ready to move forward with ease, be their best, and achieve unstoppable results. She has guided both individual and organizational transformations around the world for more than 25 years and has been featured on ABC, CBS, the Boston Herald, Wall Street Select, Fox, and NBC. She is also an award-winning, best-selling author and poet. Elizabeth, I'm so happy to have you with me on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you, Susie. Thank you for having me.
And I'm so glad that we connected in this space, in this virtual world where we get to make connections around the world. You're joining me from Nigeria, so we don't let anything stand in the way.
Exactly.
And I'd love to hear a little bit about how through the story of your experience, the focus that you've had over the years, why do you feel it's so important now to be having this conversation about the way that perfectionists show up in the world or how that relates to the work that we're doing?
Well, my own story really, I guess, hit in about 2012. And I call it my midlife meltdown because I was trying to be the perfect everything and it was killing me. I was trying to be the perfect mom, the perfect boss, the perfect friend, the perfect wife, I mean, you name it. And it was crushing, that pressure to try to be perfect and knowing that I was completely imperfect, that disconnect was so crushing that at that point, it literally almost killed me because I felt so unworthy. And, that's a common theme that we can talk about with perfectionism. And so the funny thing is, though, it also saved me because what I was thinking of and researching, like, okay, well, I'm never going to be perfect and I'm never going to be good enough and I might as well just stop, right? But it saved me because I couldn't find the perfect way to end it all. And so my journey has taken me through unwinding these things and realizing that these perfectionistic traits and behaviors and perfectionism, because to be a perfectionist, I mean, it's part of our identity, and we wear our high standards as a brand of honor. But internally, when that inner critic gets going, it burns a brand of shame. And yet on the outside, I mean, people who worked with me had no idea. And so when I came out with my first book about my healing journey out of suicidal depression, they were like, we had no idea, my coworkers at that time. And I was like, of course you had no idea. I didn't want anybody to know. Like, I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. Because what? I wasn't perfect. And so it's really my mission to help all perfectionists find and lasting joy and expand their self-love.
I really love that. I think that everybody can certainly do for expanding our self love, but especially as you're talking about people who have that high level of requirements, they hold themselves to such an impossibly high standard. And that inner critic that, just as you say, you would never let anyone else see is working away behind that facade as perfect as we can make it to keep the outside world humming along, can really add up quickly to bring you down, I think. And you
Mhm.
have a quiz, so people can assess where they tend to fall in perfectionist tendencies. And I can see some aspects, not all. And so I can find points of relatability. I've certainly heard, and perhaps our audience has heard people say, don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. And so we can bring a logical perspective to it, but at the same time, when we're holding ourselves to this kind of standard, logic isn't always the best way to approach it, or to maybe to counter the impact of that perfectionist tendency. How did you recognize in yourself that you were holding yourself to a standard that just wasn't possible, unfortunately?
Well, it really took some time to recognize and create awareness because um, I had only ever really heard that, oh, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. And it's, of course, a brand of honor. Like, oh, if they ask you in an interview, like, what's your, weakness? Oh, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, right? But there isn't a whole lot that talks about kind of the kryptonite. Okay, we think of perfectionism and all that as our superpower, and it can be. It's that there's this whole side of kryptonite to it that when we don't recognize it, it just saps our superpower. And so I help people really get into this focused flow of not this all or nothing mentality. And for me, it was creating awareness of, more and more that, okay, I'm expecting myself to be here. I feel like I'm, much lower. There's this gap, and I call it the not good enough gap. Um, how am I going to close that? And for a really long time, decades, I thought I could fill that gap by accomplishing things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was, I think there was a pivotal moment when I was looking through this Strengths Finder assessment that I had done years before. And it said one of my top strengths was achievement orientation. And I thought, yeah, I am achievement oriented. I like to get things done. I like to, but the reality is that I was trying to prove my worth. I was trying to feel good enough by doing things or getting things done. So I was a human. And what was, I think, really stunning was that assessment said, this is never going to go away.
Mm.
You're always going to be unsatisfied with your achievements. And I thought, oh, is that why I have this like hole in my soul where every accomplishment just, no matter how big, no matter how great, like momentarily feels good, but then gets sucked into this black hole of not good enough. And I'm happy to report that through these practices, and mostly it was because I was focusing on trying to figure out how to be happy and make it last, because I didn't realize that I had so much anxiety and depression because I had kept myself so busy over the years, so that I wouldn't notice. And it was really coming out of that and embracing all of these things about myself and expanding self love that really made the difference. Now, saying it is one thing, doing it is a whole other thing.
There's the path to recognition, and then the path to making that claim for yourself, and then actually integrating it. Absolutely. It's definitely a process that we keep coming back to, I think.
Well, and I think that's a really good point, Susie, because self development is never done. And what had happened with me is that I had thought, look, these are some issues I have, put them on a to do list, check them off one by one. Ta-da! Like my to do list of self development is to done. But that's not the way it works. And what had happened for me was I, in 2012, I had just come out of like a period where I had done a lot of self development work in the previous few years, and I had got to a really great place. And I stopped doing all those practices one by one. And then I got even deeper. But I'm so grateful because I got to a deeper level. I mean, you can't get any deeper than rock bottom. So every way was up.
Yeah, and I appreciate too, and I hope that people understand in your part of the story that, even with the work that you've been putting in, that you've been doing, refining, developing yourself, trying to check things off of our personal to-do list, that instead of that being a linear path, I think a lot of times it is cyclical, and we uncover more things that we have to deal with. Instead of feeling like we've made progress, it feels like a setback, which I'm sure can be very overwhelming when you're achievement oriented and off the list means progress, not setbacks.
Right. It's like, holy crap, didn't I fix you? Didn't I fix myself? Like, isn't this done? But I've discovered that here's what happens. Anytime we expand our comfort zone, these traits and behaviors, especially the perfectionistic traits and behaviors, because they were formed very early on and in some instances are carried through DNA,
Mm.
as research has shown. And so all of these things started before we were even verbal. Okay. So these perfectionistic traits and behaviors, once we expand our comfort zone, they pop up again. But the thing is, when we have practices and habits that we form and greater awareness, then it's like, oh, hello, old friend, welcome. Let's have a chat. So this is what's going on now. It's so much easier to deal with, and this is what I've found, and this is what I work with my clients on.
And so I would imagine a good number of people might be sitting there saying, "You're talking about me." I really resemble these comments that are being shared. And so what in your experience is the extent of it? How widespread is perfectionism? Because I feel like we tend to hold to ourselves and not confess we might be perfectionists, maybe as, like a social party, like a quip, but not really be present to what that means and how that impacts. So how common is it that people are really struggling with these issues?
Well, according to research that I found, 1 in 3 are perfectionists. So it is pretty widespread. And then when you get in the leadership echelons and business owners, entrepreneurs, um, I would say that it's probably more than 1 in 3 because of the achievement orientation. Okay, so the interesting thing is, and just let this sink in for a second, the research shows that perfectionists are successful in spite of, not because of, these exceptionally high standards that we put on ourselves. That, which is stunning,
Yes, yes.
because we all attribute it to, look, I'm doing so great because I have high standards, and we all know that it puts us into overwhelm, and we say yes when we really don't want to say yes. We pile up things on our plate because we're people pleasers, and we have issues with boundaries. Like, we're trying so hard to prove our worth through doing things, that human doing part,
Mm-hmm.
that um, it puts us into a lot of overwhelm. And so we have 3 types of perfectionists. Okay, and they're not mutually exclusive, by the way. Okay, you can be all of them.
Great. You don't hear one and say,
Okay,
"Okay, I
or
don't have to
just
worry about the
one.
others."
Yeah. So there's self-oriented perfectionism. Okay. So the self-oriented perfectionist is setting high standards for him or herself. And the definition really, it isn't just about the high standards. Okay? Because lots of people have high standards. And just because you have exceptionally high standards does not a perfectionist make. It's what comes along with it. It's the never feeling that you meet those standards. It's the not feeling good enough, and that inner critic and all of that that comes along with it. It's the meaning and the interpretation that we make when we make a mistake, or we don't feel we've achieved that standard that we set for ourselves. That not good enough gap is the definition of a self-oriented perfectionist. And it's really interesting. I'll just tell you a little tidbit here, because when I started my work with, specifically with perfectionists, I was talking with my husband, and he was like, "Why do you keep saying I'm not a perfectionist?" And I said, "Because you don't meet the definition." He's like, "I have high standards." And I said, "Yeah, but you don't beat yourself up over it if you don't meet them." And he goes, "Yeah, why would I do that?"
But from the outside looking in, it feels like maybe I should be more of a perfectionist. So that's a really interesting story. I love it.
So I said to him, "Well, you're an other-oriented perfectionist, okay? You have high standards, but you expect other people to meet your standards, and you're upset when they don't meet them. But you don't beat yourself up over it." So there's self-oriented perfectionists, and so when we don't meet the expectations we set for ourselves, we beat ourselves up. There's other oriented perfectionism, okay, and that's directed toward other people. It's like, well, I can't delegate to that person because they're not going to meet my standards, and da, 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 da. So then there's socially oriented perfectionism. And this is at almost epidemic proportions now,
Mm.
especially in the younger age groups, teenagers, college age, because of this social media picture perfect kind of influence that has happened over the past, couple decades. So you can be all three of these. And I call that the perfectionism trifecta. And that's me.
So you can put on all three hats. You can sit with people coming from whichever is their primary driver. And I would imagine that it can shift. We can go from being self-oriented to other-oriented and
Right. So this is the fascinating thing because most people who are perfectionists will say, well, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist in such and such. Like, I'm not a perfectionist about everything. Well, actually, you are. But so here's the deal with perfectionists, we have an all or nothing mentality. Either it's 150% or it's zero and we don't even start on it and we get stuck. Okay.
mm.
So the things that we put over in the zero, like, well, I'm not going to worry about this. And I'll tell you, one of mine is like, I'm not a super duper house cleaner. I'm what you call a relaxed house cleaner. Okay. That's in my like zero category. I'm not going to be doing that 150%, except sometimes. Except sometimes I'll get that little, that old toothbrush out and I'll clean the grout and like something that I thought was going to take 15 minutes, 3 hours later, I'm getting it perfect, right?
I love that. And I
So
mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I think it also just goes to show that we go through different phases and stages. There are different priorities, and I love as you're talking about that inner gremlin because I do think that is something that just about everyone can relate to, but maybe the volume that it can take on when you're a perfectionist is a different animal.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, Susie, because the more that we're under stress, these perfectionistic traits and tendencies are going to come up even stronger. So I remember some years back when we were in the midst of wedding planning, not mine, but my daughter's, and trying to get everything just so. So, chances are, if you're a perfectionist parent, one or more of your children is going to be a perfectionist also. My mother was a perfectionist. I have siblings who are perfectionists. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So, really ramping up because I was, I wanted things to be perfect. Okay, I wanted them to be just right. I might not have said perfect at the time, but I just wanted them to be right. And there were all these workers around who were like, "Yeah, this is good enough." And I was like, "No, it is not good enough." And I was like, "Okay, take a chill pill." I started noticing like I was I was getting stressed about it, and I was like, really, it is good enough. Who's going to notice besides me? It's done. I'm over it.
Making the choice to find a point at which you can let go. What is a piece of advice for perfectionists who are struggling with that inner critic, who have trouble saying, okay, this is where I can let that go?
The biggest difference that in my life and what I help my clients with, and there's a whole methodology to this, but Here's the simplest thing I can boil it down to: make friends with your inner critic.
Mm.
The thing is, that inner critic is there as a protector. Even though it sounds very often, especially when we're stressed, especially when we're worried or fearful, it may sound very negative, very critical. It actually, he or she is trying to protect us. And I would suggest you befriend that inner critic. It doesn't really, that inner critic doesn't really mean the harm that it creates. So see if you can shift some of the conversation that you're having with yourself and your inner critic to what would a best friend say. So, sometimes like we make a mistake and we're like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that? I shouldn't have, go through all of that. But the thing is, Susie, if you came to me and you said, oh, I made a mistake and this happened, I wouldn't say to you those things that my inner critic says to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would try to empathize with you, give you some compassion, encouragement. So see how you can just shift the dialogue so that your inner critic becomes more like what a best friend might say to you. Now, it isn't always going to work, but there is this dynamic going on with the inner dialogue, this um, inner voice that we have that can be critical. But we can really embrace, and this is what comes from loving, expanding the self love, is because that inner critic, that petulance, that criticalness, it's actually coming from the parts that we reject about ourselves. So it's like our inner child feeling wounded. Have you ever watched a little kid who like, well, if I don't want to do that, and then like that kind of attitude. Well, if you don't want to play, I don't want to play with you either. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so recognize that it's really about accepting all these parts of ourselves, and as we do this step by step, and it does take time, that will completely shift.
I really love that. And thank you for that reflection about how we can engage with that voice. Because I think people are very tempted to try to hit the mute button instead of looking for a way to engage and be curious. Where is that inner critic coming from? Why does it snap back so hard in certain situations? Like you said, when stress is up, when we're under a deadline, different things are going on, we're already depleted because other things are impacting us, maybe health wise or in relationships. And boy, it can be hard to hold space with that voice. So I love that suggestion of engaging with it, of recognizing that influence, and of looking for ways to redirect it. It's not about muting it. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and it's step by step. So we want to do things that are like, you don't want to turn it on full volume because that can be overwhelming too, especially if you're already depressed. But one of the first practices I did was I actually wrote out some of those things that my inner critic was screaming at me. And I went with it, and I let the negative, I actually wanted to prove the negative and the And the thing was, as soon as I like allowed the negative and said, okay, so, I'm ugly and I'm fat and I'm this and I'm that, um, all of a sudden, but no, you're not. Like you're da, 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 da. So it was really weird because instead of pushing it away and trying to hit the mute button, I was like, okay, talk. And it's like, wait, you're listening to me. Okay, we can say some nice things now.
I just needed to be heard.
Yeah, so that's why I say it's about befriending, but do it like a kiddie pool. Don't like start trying to surf the ocean of emotion with your inner critic. Just dip your toe into the kiddie pool and then you'll graduate to the bigger pool, and then maybe you can step in the surf of the ocean of emotion, and then you can kind of boogie board, and then you can surf the ocean of emotion. It's a step by step process.
Yes, thank you for that. I think, especially being achievement oriented, we want to say, okay, I'm ready to tackle this. We're digging out all the dirt and I'm going to sit with it all. Nobody's getting up from this table until we're clear.
Yeah, just remember it's not a to do list that you check off on your self development. So that's why I call them practices.
Yes, practices. And I love your suggestion of, I'm a big fan of journaling exercises. I think when we give ourselves that kind of opportunity to let things come up past that first layer, dropping into a lower level of recognition or just seeing what words come up, it's really interesting to see how things can resolve themselves. Like you said, with that experiment, the voice kind of ran out of steam. Oh, you are listening to me.
Right. And then the more we listen, things like that. And like you said, journaling. Like I remember I did a forgiveness exercise, and it said, what do you believe about forgiveness? And I wrote a few things. And then the last thing was that I didn't deserve forgiveness. And that was really shocking, really woke me up. And I thought, wow, okay, there's some there's some more exploration to be doing there.
And not
So
necessarily in
that's a
that same sitting, in that same session, but okay, all right.
oh no 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 no. Yeah. Because you see what I recognized was when I told you early on that the perfectionism almost killed me, it was almost, I would say the bulk of it was around mom guilt. And I mean, every parent has some guilt, okay? Uh, but mine was really severe and it took a lot of forgiveness. And that's why the third book that I've written is all about how I healed my mom guilt.
I think a lot of parents, mothers and parents would benefit from that perspective, because I do think that is something that they can carry and not recognize how it's weighing them down and impacting that relationship with their children too.
Absolutely. And one of the stunning things was when I started to talk about things with my family, that I had the burdens I had been carrying. And as I started forgiving myself, I had conversations with other family members. They were carrying a burden for the exact same thing. So I was blaming myself. Somebody else was blaming him or herself, right? And so by having this conversation, we were actually able to unburden all of us. It was an amazing process.
Mm. That's really beautiful, and what a gift to make space for that. It's not an easy conversation to begin, but within that space, unexpected healing is able to
Right.
happen.
Yeah, it was really wonderful and so such a surprise.
Please share with our audience where they can learn more about the books that you've written. It sounds like there's really, really valuable insights in all of them, and how they can connect with you to move forward if they'd like to learn more.
Okay, great. I have a couple of websites. One is elizabethonyeabor.com, and that's where you can find out about my books. And habitualhappiness.hub.com is another place where you can find out about the work that I do with perfectionists. And I founded the Habitual Happiness Hub because I I feel that it's a practice. Like I choose lasting joy and I do it through my practices because one of the number one things I wanted to make sure is that I could continue these practices and really sustain what I had discovered. So they can connect with me on social media, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and Twitter and Instagram. And also, I have a gift that I'm sharing. It's called Seven Powerful Practices for Perfectionists.
Oh.
And Susie will share the link. And this goes through seven things. The first is the perfectionist mindset. The second is excellent goals. The third is results. The fourth is finding forgiveness. The fifth is empathy and compassion. The sixth is connection with the full self. And the seventh is taking time to celebrate. And all of these acronyms together spell perfect because you were born perfect. You don't have to strive to be perfect.
I really love that. And I think that there's something for absolutely everyone in that. Certainly for the perfectionists in the group, but certainly for everyone else who, we push ourselves. Sometimes that inner critic can go round and be holding us back. And so that sounds really terrific. I love the breadth of what you're sharing in that resource. So I hope folks take advantage. We'll definitely have the link in the show notes, as well as those points of connection with Elizabeth, so you can move forward there if you want to learn more. There's so much to this conversation, and I appreciate your two coming back to the choices that we make, the habits that we can build to move ourselves in the direction that we choose. It surprises some people when I say that happiness is a bit of a triggering word because it doesn't come easily. So I appreciate that you're sharing tools to help people find out how to build that for themselves.
And I'd like to give one last tip in that regard. And that is, I call them habits and practices, but they're day by day. I don't call them daily because of this whole thing of all or nothing. Like, as a perfectionist, if we don't do it perfectly, we're like, oh, well then, okay, I'll just stop, or oh, I have to start over, or then we beat ourselves up. So give yourself permission to do day by day practices to build momentum. If you skip a day or two, totally okay. Just continue the momentum. That's the really important thing. So I call them day by day practices to give myself and others permission.
Thank you for that. That's a really important part. I think that we tend to, as we've been discussing, be our own worst critic, but then certainly underestimate what we're capable of because we're only tracking the ways in which we feel we fall short instead of recognizing the progress that we make. So I love that you talk about moving into momentum, recognizing where we are showing up the way that we want to, and changing our focus. Again, it's definitely a practice. It takes some muscle building in that regard.
Yep, and it's lifelong, but it gets easier. And
Yes.
it's totally worth it.
Marvelous. Thank you so much. There's really, really a lot to think about here in this conversation. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that comes to mind before we go today?
So I think there's maybe just one last thing, and that is the biggest myth about the perfectionist mindset. And I kind of touched on it, but I want to be very specific here. The biggest myth is that we think through achievements, we're going to close that not good enough gap. But here's what happens. So the biggest myth is we're not going to close it through achieving. Because what happens is when we set a goal and we don't think it's good enough, we have this not good enough gap. But research also shows that when we have this really high standard and we actually meet it, we somehow say to ourselves, oh, that was too easy. I should have set a higher standard. And we create a not good enough gap. Now, it's not comfortable to feel not good enough, but it's familiar. And we create that familiar not good enough gap ourselves. So it's this no-win situation that we create of not good enough, and accomplishments and doing are not going to close the gap. It's through tapping into the human being and the expanding self-love that is going to close that not good enough gap.
Wow, I'm so glad you brought us back to that, because that is something I think a lot of people will probably have their eyes open a little bit bigger the way that mine just did. Because it's that point of comfort. Our comfort zone is to see how we fell short. It really does take building new practices and habits to celebrate.
It's familiar. It doesn't feel good.
Right.
Yep.
That's an important thing.
Yeah, and that's why we don't celebrate our successes, because we never feel like we've been successful.
I should have been more successful. That's where I felt at that time.
Yeah, like, oh, well, I did that. That was too easy. And it's like, even if it's like Herculean effort to do it, somehow we're like, well, wow, I met it. I should have set it higher. Like, and it's not, I mean, this is the way all self-oriented perfectionists think. It's the mindset. So it's really about the awareness and shifting and doing, and actually more being than doing.
Yes.
Like being first, then do. So be, then do.
I'm a huge fan of that.
Yeah.
I think that there's so much.
So I'll close with that thought. You are a human being. Yeah.
Not the sum of what you have done. That's marvelous. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. I really appreciate everything that you've shared. So much food for thought here. And certainly, then, we've got the resources in the show notes if you want to connect with Liz and see what she is creating, what she's sharing in the world. Stay inspired with these brilliant insights. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. This has been terrific.
Thank you, Susie. It's been my pleasure.
Have a great day. Take good care. Thank you for tuning in today. Check out the show notes for any links we mentioned. To learn more about living life with less stress and more flow, visit happifiedlife.com. And if you found value in today's episode, make sure you subscribe to catch the next one and leave a review to help fellow pod surfers find Happified. Until next time, keep on shining.